Tens of thousands of Brazilians are calling on their president to step down. They blame Dilma Rousseff for a corruption scandal involving a state-owned oil company and a weak economy. But is Rousseff to blame? And what does this mean for Brazil's democracy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. She's less than a year into her second term as president, but tens of thousands of Brazilians are now calling for Dilma Rousseff to be impeached. The embattled leader is accused of being complicit in corruption and has become the target of anger over a worsening economy and harsh austerity measures. Before we bring in our guests, Hod Abdelhamid sets things up for us from Rio de Janeiro.
This is the third time there are large-scale protests in this country since President Dilma Rousseff was re-elected less than a year ago. Now they come at a time where her popularity rate is at 7.7%, the lowest ever for a democratically elected president. There were marches in many cities across the country. The largest ones were in the capital Brasilia, Sao Paulo, and here in Rio de Janeiro. Out with Dilma, out with the Workers' Party, they chanted, as the march slowly moved along Copacabana beach. The same message resonated in over 100 other cities and towns across the country, including the Northeast, once considered Dilma Rousseff's stronghold. The demonstrators' anger was triggered by the Petrobras corruption scandal that led to the arrest of dozens of people, including members of the ruling party.
The money that they are stealing from this country, they don't have conscience, they don't have heart, because the corruption is killing millions and millions of Brazilians, people.
Here in Rio, many were from the middle class that had seen steady growth over the past decade. Now it's feeling the pinch of the economic crisis. But while the protesters were making their voices heard, many more people preferred to spend their Sunday on the beach. They share the same discontent, but don't agree with the calls for impeachment.
There has always been corruption in this country, but they are not demonstrating against corruption. They are demonstrating against a party, against PT, against this government, as if the solution is, if PT doesn't exist, all the problems in Brazil are solved.
Many fear that those calls to oust the president will only lead to more instability. But no matter how large they are, protests and low popularity rates are not enough to impeach a president in this country. It would require some sort of legal wrongdoing on her behalf during her presidency. And so far, none of the ongoing investigations have directly implicated her in the many corruption scandals that are plaguing this country. Still, it won't be easy for Dilma Rousseff. In the coming days, she will have to pass more austerity measures, and that will certainly not help her when it comes to popular support.
Joining us are our guests in Rio de Janeiro, Rodrigo Nunez, lecturer in modern and contemporary philosophy at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. In Washington, D.C., Paulo Sotero, director of the Brazil Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And joining us on Skype from Champaign, Illinois, Mark Hertzman, assistant professor of history at the University of Illinois, specializing in Latin America. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you to this edition of Inside Story. Rodrigo Nunez, how bad is the situation looking now for Dilma Rousseff?
I would say it certainly looks less bad since last week, which doesn't necessarily mean it looks less bad for the country. I think there is an emerging pact among political elites that is going to stabilize the crisis in the political system. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to stabilize the wider crisis, not only of the economy, but also between the political system and the population at large.
Sorry, what are you saying? That the political elite are now talking to each other and they realize that they all have to present some sort of united front to put an end to this crisis?
Yes, that's definitely what's happening in the last week. A new approximation, a new rapprochement between PT and PMDB, its nominal coalition partner, which was causing the most trouble to PT, but also with the industrial and financial sectors. Everyone seems to realize that while it was good to play with the threat of impeachment or with the threat of destabilization in order to get further concessions from the government, this is too dangerous a game to play because it could get out of hand. And no one really wants, or none of the people with power really want that at this moment, I don't think.
Paulo Sotero, I saw you nodding away there. Do you agree that she's possibly been pulled back from the brink?
Yes, she has gained probably 2 weeks to a month to try to reorganize her own defense. There is this process of accommodation going on with some problems. For instance, the charge about the accounting of her government, the ones she's going to have to respond to now are more serious than the ones she was facing before. This will happen in the next 15 days, and this could lead us to a concrete cause for impeachment that does not exist now. An impeachment has to be based on what we call in Brazil, or the Constitution in Brazil call a crime of responsibility. Now, at the same time, the opposition remains divided about the wisdom of impeaching or not impeaching President Dilma Rousseff. The important element, in my view, about the protest that went on yesterday in Brazil is the endorsement by the population, and this is also shared with people that were not in the protest, for the rule of law, for the prosecutor's office, the federal prosecutor's office, and the federal judiciary to pursue and to continue investigations against massive corruption that took place at Petrobras involving senior bureaucrats, government agencies, politicians, including some of the leading members of Congress that would have to deal with the impeachment, and obviously also CEOs and major executives of companies in Brazil that are very, very large and very important. So I think we are in the middle of this process, and one more bad news in the picture is the fact that now economists agree Brazil is now in a recession and will probably remain in a recession next year.
Okay, you touched on quite a few points there. Mark Hertzman, let me talk to you about the position now that Dilma Rousseff finds herself in. Do you agree that she's been given just a little breathing space, that possibly things, though, could get worse very soon?
Yeah, I think so. And, you know, perhaps rather than that she's been given this time, I think, from my understanding, is she's really sort of won this time for herself with a lot of maneuvering this past week. And I think one of the points made earlier that was really important was the difference between stabilizing things within the government and in sort of the broader population. And my sense is that at this point, I mean, it's impossible to tell what will happen, but at this point, things within the governing elite, many of whom have been entwined in this scandal from the opposition, even people calling for her impeachment. So this is not something that is just a PT issue.
No, because it seemed that she was really pushed in the corner, wasn't it? I mean, it was almost impossible for her to operate, to pass anything.
Absolutely, because and as has been said already, I mean, even a week ago, things looked like her own vice president, like there was nobody, and she really did a remarkable job, it seems like, with the maneuvering. What remains with people in the streets, and we should go back maybe just very quickly beyond her re-election, these other protests that happened earlier around the World Cup. There's a lot of unrest and dissatisfaction with the system at large in Brazil, and not all of it is directed or coming out of this particular scandal. But with the economy in the same sort of direction, there is a lot. So I just think that's a very important point, the separation between what's happening within the halls of government and what's happening on the streets.
Okay, let's take a quick look now at the woman in focus, Dilma Rousseff. She is the first woman to become president of Brazil. Before she was elected in 2010, she was chairwoman of the board at the state-owned oil company Petrobras, which we've been talking about. During a time when there is alleged to have been widespread corruption, she maintained pretty high approval ratings in her first term, but things went downhill in March and April of this year when the Petrobras scandal broke and millions of protesters called on Rousseff to resign. Her approval rating now stands at 8%, the lowest since the previous president was impeached in 1992. Rodrigo, it must be very hard working with that sort of approval rating, very hard to convince anyone in the country that what you're doing is right for the country.
Yeah, but I think we also should take a slightly longer perspective. We can't just trace her problems back to, say, March, when the first of these kinds of protests happened, because the decline in her popularity also has a lot to do with the deterioration of the economy, which is something that dates back already at least to 2014. It has to do with the very aggressive campaign that PT ran in these elections, and claiming that anyone else was going to implement the agenda that PT has effectively implemented since Rousseff was re-elected. And also, if we go a little further back to the 2013 protests, which were the first time, they are very different from the protests that are happening now. I think it's very important that we understand that dissatisfaction with the government is much broader and much more diverse than what we saw in the streets yesterday. This is only a very particular subset of the people who are dissatisfied or who oppose the government at the moment. But certainly the 2013 protests created the opportunity, the political opportunity, both for this kind of protest and for the more proactive behavior of the opposition since, which has effectively cornered Rousseff to the point where she can only implement now what was effectively the opposition's agenda during the campaign. And that is, of course, a major reason for her popularity, because she's seen as doing the opposite of what she promised to do.
Mark, where does this leave the opposition? But because by all accounts, I'm hearing that the opposition is rather divided, that there's no great strength in the opposition, and that it's been described as this attack on her as an agenda of hate, lacking any real ideological convictions. Is that all true?
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I was in Brazil during the run-up to the re-election, and one of the things that was very clear was that people in general were not thrilled on the left or the right with Dilma. I talked to a lot of people who were committed leftists who were not going to vote for Dilma in the first round to send a message, they said, and then they would ultimately vote for her. The opposition really never found someone to galvanize around, and my sense is that the corruption scandal, and as we just heard, I think it's a great point, the World Cup protests really did kind of unleash this new sort of form and moment of mass protest that we've seen before, but that's reborn in a new way now. And I think this has really kind of given an opening to people who had a little bit of a pent-up sort of hate against Dilma, against the PT, a number of things. And there really have been, people are starting to report now there's been a number of sort of dirty tricks and even sort of violence that in a lot of ways reminds me of some of the things that are going on in the US and with calls for impeachment against Obama. There's not really an ideological center. It's more about power and some sort of disgust or hate in general with the person who's in power.
Paolo, I know that these protests and these calls for impeachment are worrying many in the country. They feel that this could have a direct impact on democracy in the country. Is that a fair worry?
Well, it is, because we have elected 4 presidents since restatement of democracy. If we are forced to impeach President Dilma, if there is cause for that, and I'm sure that if there is cause, she will likely be impeached. It would be, 4 presidents elected, 2 presidents impeached. This is not a good picture for a young democracy. So I believe that the adults in the room, including former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, have positioned themselves against the idea of impeachment so far, because basically there is no cause for that unless Congress, the accounting tribunal, or the corruption investigations find cause. There is no reason to produce. This is a political process so far. I don't agree with the business of hate fueling this. I believe that the government was, in the first government of President Hu, was utterly incompetent in the way they managed the economy. This is a crisis that was produced by a set of policies that now have to be reversed, and she has recognized that. But President Dilma Rousseff is seen, even by members of the opposition, as an honest individual. It doesn't mean, though, that she does not have political responsibility in what happened during the time she was both the chairperson of the board at Petrobras and president. So
Okay.
I think what we are trying to do is to accommodate, to create space, to find a political solution to this, which is, by the way, the traditional way of doing things in Brazil, with one difference now. There is really intolerance against corruption in Brazilian society.
Okay, well, I was going to ask, excuse me jumping in here, I was going to ask Rodrigo about that, this intolerance against corruption, as you put it, Paolo, and the fact that people are taking to the streets. Maybe that's a healthy sign that democracy is alive and well there, the fact that people feel that they can speak out against leaders.
No, absolutely. I think there's definitely something healthy going on. At the same time, there is a very particular way in which this discourse gets mobilized by, say, corporate media or opposition leaders, and certainly several of the people, most of the people perhaps, who took to the streets yesterday, which is a very selective way of talking about corruption. I think it's important to understand the way in which the corruption discourse functions in Brazilian politics. On the one hand, at a moment when PT in power was working, was delivering what it said it would deliver, that was one of the few things that could stick against PT, because you couldn't tell people whose material lives were improving that this government was bad. So the two things that could work at that time was talking about corruption, which happens in under a PT government as much as it happens under every other government in Brazil, of course, and a socially conservative agenda, which I think is where the discussion on hate speech is coming from. There's definitely been a rise of that also, because it's one thing that could be mobilized against the government at a time where the poorest were actually getting a much better deal than they normally would.
All right.
So there's still a very distinct selectiveness to the way that people talk about corruption. But yes, absolutely, it's definitely a healthy sign that this is happening.
And obviously not healthy on the economy, though, because Brazil was once an example for the emerging markets boom, but it's now in real trouble. The economy is expected to shrink this year and next year. Its currency, the real, has fallen by 34% against the dollar to its lowest point since 2003. And credit rating agencies have put Brazil's debt one notch above junk. The unfolding scandal at Petrobras has wiped out 50% of the value of its stock, which is important because a state-owned energy company accounts for around 10% of Brazil's economic activity. I know that Paolo touched on this briefly, Mark, but do you believe that what's happened with Petrobras and the knock-on effect could pull Brazil into recession?
Well, I think that is, you know, probably beyond doubt. But I think that there's more to the story than just the policies of the PT that have led to the recession. In some ways, is a very old story in Latin America and in any kind of post-colonial society, dealing with so many variables on the world market. So it seems certain that Brazil is in recession, from what I understand, and that I'm not an economist, but that will, as Paulo said, will continue. But I do think it's a little reductive to link this simply to the policies of Dilma and the PT, which, as also has been pointed out, have really done some amazing things that have lifted so many people up, and that now that's sort of starting to end.
Okay.
We have more issues.
Paula, I'm wondering what sort of impact this is having on Brazil's image on the global stage. I mean, the fact it's one of the BRIC members, it's supposed to be one of the strongest emerging economies. Where does this leave its reputation and its role in foreign economies?
I think it's a negative impact, obviously. Brazil is sort of out of the picture internationally after having, especially during President Lula's term, Lula being a very charismatic leader, a very aggressive foreign policy, introducing Brazil to the world as an emerging economy that was really becoming more equal socially at home, and this was really the major argument, the visiting card for Brazil, and President Lula liked foreign policy. The contrast started under President Dilma Rousseff because she is not a politician and she does not do well the rituals of foreign policy, so there were missed opportunities. But the main factor here, I believe, is the economy. A Brazil in recession is a problem for itself, for its neighbors. The image has deteriorating. This whole business of the rating agencies downgrading Brazil's sovereign debt obviously affect that. But on the positive side, I insist, there are the investigations on corruption. I understand that corruption has always existed in Brazil, but starting in 2013, because of the massive protests, Brazil and Dilma Rousseff, to her credit, signed into law a new provision allowing for plea bargaining. A lot of the accusations are coming from that. So Brazil is making progress internally, institutionally, but the image obviously is being affected. I am confident that as Brazil recovers, the image will recover.
Yeah, Rodrigo, I was just going to ask you, can Dilma Rousseff turn this around? Can she become, again, a bigger player on the international stage, possibly by forging closer ties with the US?
I think at this point, she might try anything to claw her way back from the situation she's in. I'm not sure there are many things she can do that would work, and this is where I would problematize a little the question that the main problem is the economy right now. Certainly, the economy is a huge problem, but there's also a certain, well, first of all, the fact that the political debate right now is dominated by the discussion on having to do something about the economy has to do with pushing a strictly pro-business agenda, which is the opposite of what PT managed to, or not the entire opposite, but is only one half of what PT promised for the last decade. But I think this also ignores the extent to which the crisis within the political system is something of a pantomime that is talking about real problems most of the time in a false way. I think the big elephant in the room that appeared in 2013 with the June protests and hasn't been properly discussed yet in the political system.
Okay, Rodrigo, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it there.
We've run out of time between the population and the political system itself.
So Dilma Rousseff, a lady's got a lot of work cut out for her. Thank you so much to my guests, Rodrigo Nunez, Paulo Sotera and Mark Hertzman. And thank you for watching this episode of Inside Story. If you have any comments about today's show, you can get in touch by going to our program page at aljazeera.com or post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or even tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Jane Dutton, and the whole team, goodbye for now.